The Arctic wind shrieked through the fractured cabin window with the voice of winter's fury driving crystalline snow against weathered logs that groaned under nature's relentless assault. Each frozen gust sent spirals of white powder dancing through the interior shadows, where 32-year-old Hattie Winifred crouched beside the dying embers of what had once promised warmth and life. Her ink-stained fingers trembled, not merely from the penetrating cold, but from the growing certainty that she might perish in this God-forsaken place alone and forgotten by the civilized world she had abandoned. The brass transit compass gleamed with accusatory dullness in her open field case, its polished surface reflecting the last orange tongues of flame like a mirror to her failing judgment. Massachusetts felt like another lifetime entirely, though she had departed Boston merely 6 weeks prior, with hope burning bright in her chest. The correspondence from Elijah Crane had arrived with clockwork regularity throughout the previous spring and summer, each letter crafted with such meticulous attention to her professional expertise that questioning their authenticity had seemed not only unnecessary, but ungrateful. My dearest Miss Winifred. The most recent letter had begun in that familiar, educated script. The Wyoming Territory in the year 1873 presents unprecedented opportunities for a woman of your considerable cartographic talents. Our railroad expansion requires accurate surveys of previously unmapped wilderness regions, and I believe your expertise would prove invaluable. Moreover, I confess that my professional admiration has blossomed into deeper personal feelings. Yet something had nagged at her analytical mind, subtle inconsistencies in the technical discussions, references to surveying methods that seemed oddly imprecise for a trained professional. She had dismissed these concerns as differences in regional approach, but now facing death in this abandoned cabin, those tiny discrepancies felt like warning bells she had been too eager to ignore. The promise of meaningful work combined with companionate marriage had seemed like divine providence, particularly as her eyesight continued its gradual deterioration. Years of intensive close work over surveying instruments had compromised her vision in bright conditions, making the precise technical drawing that formed her professional foundation increasingly difficult. The cabin door rattled violently against its leather hinges, and through nature's symphony, she detected a different rhythm and the deliberate crunch of snowshoes approaching with human purpose. Her heart hammered as she reached for the small derringer hidden in her traveling dress, though she harbored little confidence in its effectiveness against whatever this unforgiving wilderness might deliver. The latch gave way with a sharp crack, and suddenly the doorway filled with a figure that seemed carved from winter itself. Snow cascaded from broad shoulders as the newcomer forced the door shut momentarily, muffling the wind's relentless shriek. Lakota stood 28 years in this harsh world, his commanding presence filling the small space with controlled power. An Oglala Lakota hunter, whose dark hair hung in a single braid, adorned with an eagle feather now frosted white with ice. He moved with the fluid grace of someone raised where the unprepared died without ceremony. Fresh blood stained the elk hide across his shoulders, and his breath formed distinct clouds, as obsidian eyes swept the interior with practiced efficiency. Those penetrating eyes lingered on Hattie's pale face, noting the blue tinge of her lips, despite her proximity to the failing fire, before settling on the pathetic collection of glowing coals. One robe. He said, his voice carrying quiet authority born of countless life-or-death decisions. One fire. Share both or freeze alone. Hattie's throat constricted as implications settled over her like gathering frost. Her rational mind recognized this stranger as her optimal chance of surviving until dawn, while every other instinct screamed warnings about spending the night pressed against an armed man whose intentions remained utterly unknown. Lakota seemed to read her hesitation in the rigid tension of her shoulders. Without ceremony, he unrolled the massive buffalo robe in the cabin's driest corner, then drew his hunting knife with deliberate slowness. The blade caught firelight as he placed it carefully on the floor between where they would lie. Barrier. he said, simply meeting her frightened gaze with steady resolve. Your safety. My honor. The howling wind chose that moment to launch another assault, sending fresh cascades of snow through the broken window and causing the entire structure to protest ominously. Through the chaos, Hattie detected other sounds that chilled her blood, the distant howl of wolves and the sharp crack of breaking branches as the forest succumbed to winter's violence. I am Miss Hattie Winifred, she said finally, her voice barely audible above the storm. I journeyed here to meet someone, but I fear I have been gravely deceived. Lakota nodded as he began methodically rebuilding their fire. Deception thrives in this territory. Men promise what they cannot deliver. His movements were economical practiced, or deliver what was never promised. As warmth gradually returned, Hattie studied her unexpected companion. His moccasins showed expert repairs, speaking of long wilderness experience. His bow remained strung despite apparent calm, and his movement suggested familiarity with danger that transcended casual acquaintance. You track game, she observed. Among other things, Lakota replied with slight evasion. Today I followed a wounded elk. Tomorrow, if we survive, I must return to my people with medicine they desperately need. Something in his tone suggested urgency beyond simple hunting success, but exhaustion claimed her before she could pursue the matter. The hypnotic combination of returning warmth and accumulated fear pulled her towards sleep despite every survival instinct warning against vulnerability. She awakened hours later to discover Lakota had maintained their fire throughout the night. His consideration touched something within her that had been frozen by months of loneliness and deception, offering the first glimmer of hope that perhaps not everyone in this territory sought to exploit her. Dawn arrived gray and reluctant, seeping through the storm like dirty light through glass. As Hattie reorganized her belongings, the brass catches slipped from her numbed fingers. The field case tumbled open, spilling maps, notes, and sketches across the cabin floor. Lakota's attention fixed immediately on one particular drawing, a topographical sketch she had created during her train journey from Fort Laramie. She had noted discrepancies between her observations and the printed territorial maps provided by railroad officials, making corrections where official documents contradicted the visible landscape. This represents accurate fieldwork, Lakota said, studying the sketch with growing recognition. He reached for his leather satchel and withdrew what appeared to be official U.S. Army survey maps, unfolding them beside her drawing. But these contained deliberate falsifications. The comparison revealed systematic deception that sent chills through Hattie, unrelated to temperature. According to official maps, water ran year-round through Devil's Canyon, but her sketch showed a creek bed dry for extensive periods. Miller's Ford was marked as safe passage, but Lakota's local knowledge identified unstable shale that would collapse under wagon weight. Every error guides travelers toward death, Lakota explained with controlled anger. Non-existent water sources, unstable ground, marked safe routes leading directly into Oglala winter territories, where desperate men might take desperate actions. As they compared documents, sick realization settled over Hattie. The letters from Elijah Crane had referenced these same geographical features, describing them in terms matching the false information with suspicious precision. If I were complicit in this conspiracy, she whispered, I would not have corrected their mistakes. I would have endorsed them. Lakota's hand had moved toward his knife when first discovering the connection. But now he paused, studying her face in the gray light. The genuine confusion and growing horror were difficult to fabricate, and her corrections suggested expertise applied honestly rather than deceptively. Yet, you came to meet one of them, he pointed out, though suspicion was giving way to curiosity. I believed I was meeting a legitimate surveyor. Hattie replied, her mind racing through disturbing implications. But perhaps I was brought here for an entirely different purpose, possibly as an unwitting scapegoat. Outside, the storm raged unabated. But inside, revelation was building as both began grasping the true scope of deception that had ensnared them. There exists one method to test your intentions, Lakota said finally. A treacherous path along the western ridge leads to where my people wait for medicine. If you can read terrain correctly, guide us safely across ground that would kill us if misjudged, then I will know whether to trust you. Hattie looked toward the window, seeing nothing through the impenetrable wall of driving snow. Her compromised eyesight would be further challenged by brilliant glare and the difficulty of judging distances in whiteout conditions. But the alternative was remaining until the cabin collapsed or they froze. We leave when the wind permits safe passage. She agreed. As they prepared for what might prove their final journey, Lakota helped bind her twisted wrist injured during her desperate climb to reach the cabin. His hands were gentle but efficient, and when their eyes met during the process, something passed between them that transcended desperate circumstances. Trust was taking tentative root in ground that had seemed too frozen for any emotional growth. When the gale finally diminished enough to attempt travel, they ventured into a world transformed by winter's violence. The wind struck like a physical assault, driving snow particles that stung exposed skin and made breathing a conscious effort. Hattie arranged her wool hood to protect her eyes while allowing limited vision. But within moments, her eyelashes were heavy with ice, and the brilliant landscape made her vision problems exponentially worse. Lakota moved with fluid grace across the treacherous surface, his improvised snowshoes distributing weight evenly across snow that might conceal deadly obstacles. He insisted on breaking trail testing each step before committing their combined weight to uncertain ground. The western ridge stretched before them like nature's razor edge, with fatal drops disappearing into white oblivion on either side. Hattie tested the snow with her improvised staff, a broken shovel handle from the cabin, reading subtle signs that indicated whether the surface would support human weight. "Lower path," she called, pointing toward a route that appeared more difficult, but showed evidence of solid ground. "The easier way follows a cornice that won't hold our weight." A wind slab perched on a convex rollover. Repeated rifle cracks and a settling whump told Lakota the weak layer had finally failed. Lakota adjusted their course based on her professional judgment, and as they picked their way along the treacherous slope, Hattie felt the first stirrings of genuine satisfaction since leaving Massachusetts. Her skills remained valuable in this alien landscape, and Dakota's willingness to trust her expertise suggested respect that had been lacking in her previous frontier encounters. The sharp crack of rifle fire shattered their progress like thunder in thin air, unnaturally loud in the muffled world of blizzard. The sound echoed off surrounding peaks with ominous persistence, and somewhere above came the subtle but terrifying whisper of snow beginning to shift. "There they are," the voice carried on wind, harsh with determination. "The woman and the stolen maps." Two figures emerged from snow-laden spruce trees below railroad survey crew members, bundled in heavy coats and armed with military rifles. Red bandanas around their necks marked them as part of the operation. Lakota had been investigating their coordinated approach, suggesting this encounter was neither accidental nor spontaneous. "You are surrounded," one shouted, raising his rifle toward the ridge in false confidence. "Surrender immediately." Obviously fraudulent, only two men pursued them, and their position was tactically disadvantageous. But they possessed the deadly advantage of modern firearms, while Lakota carried only traditional weapons. Lakota motioned Hattie toward a cluster of rocks, offering minimal protection, his movements remaining calm despite immediate danger. "Stay low," he murmured, fitting an arrow to his bowstring with practiced efficiency. Gunfire may trigger slope failure above us. The irony wasn't lost, and their pursuer's aggression might precipitate the very avalanche that would destroy them all. The mountain seemed to hold its breath as the first surveyor took careful aim. The metallic click of the hammer being cocked carried clearly in thin air, followed by the distinctive whistle of a bullet passing dangerously close. The shot struck rock near Hattie's head, sending stone chips and snow across their shelter. The sharp report cracked through air like thunder, and the echo seemed to hang far longer than natural acoustics should allow, suggesting the mountain itself was responding with subtle but potentially catastrophic consequences. Above them, the whisper of shifting snow grew more pronounced, like a giant drawing breath before screaming. Dakota's return shot was precision under extreme pressure. His arrow took the surveyor's hat cleanly off the shaft, passing close enough that the man felt its wind against his scalp. The message was unmistakably clear: the next shot would not miss, and unlike their firearms, his bow made no sound to further endanger them by triggering an avalanche. But the second surveyor had flanked them, gaining an angle where he could fire directly at their shelter, without exposing himself to return shot. His rifle cracked again, the bullet striking stone inches from Hattie's shoulder, close enough that she felt its heat in the sting of pulverized rock. The impact sent her sliding backward toward the ridge's edge. Her improvised staff skittered away as she lost footing on the treacherous surface. Below, the 1,000-foot drop yawned like an open grave, and she felt herself slipping inexorably toward certain death. Terror seized her throat as the world tilted sickeningly. The wind howled in her ears, became deafening, drowning out even her own scream as she clawed desperately at the icy surface. Her fingers found nothing but loose snow that gave way beneath her weight, and she felt the horrible sensation of sliding backward into empty air. Time seemed to slow as she glimpsed the abyss below, jagged rocks jutting like broken teeth from the white void, promising instant death to anyone foolish enough to test their mercy. The cold bit through her clothing with vindictive pleasure, and she could taste copper fear in her mouth as gravity claimed her with inexorable mathematics. Then Dakota's powerful hand seized her coat with desperate strength, his body becoming her anchor against the slope's murderous angle. For a terrifying eternity, they hung suspended between safety and death, the wind whipping around them like winter's own malevolent breath, while she felt his muscles strain against forces that cared nothing for human will or determination. "Hold to me," he said, his voice steady despite their desperate situation. Warm breath against her ear, providing comfort that transcended physical predicament. "Do not look down. Do not think about the fall. Focus only on my voice." She pressed her face against his shoulder, fighting vertigo that threatened to overwhelm rational thought. She could feel his heart beating strongly against her cheek, steady and reassuring despite the chaos swirling around them, and somehow found strength to dig her fingers into snow and help pull them both back from destruction's brink. They crawled toward better cover as bullets continued snapping through air with deadly precision. But their pursuer's aggression was having consequences beyond immediate tactical concerns. The repeated rifle shots had disturbed the delicate equilibrium of snowpack above, and now a low rumble filled the air, the warning song of impending avalanche that would dwarf any human conflict. The sound started as barely audible vibration, felt more than heard, but grew steadily in volume and intensity as thousands of tons of accumulated snow began shifting. Trees creaked ominously, their snow-laden branches shedding white burden in anticipation of greater catastrophe building above. What began as whispered threat became a living entity of destruction. The mountain itself seemed to convulse as the snowpack lost its tenuous grip on steep slopes. First came scattered chunks breaking free and rolling downhill. But within heartbeats, it gathered inexorable momentum of natural disaster, growing into a white tide of annihilation that swept away everything in its path. The roar was indescribable, like the Aya Valley shaking roar that drowned every other sound, reshaping Earth according to divine whim. Trees, centuries old, vanished in seconds, boulders the size of houses rolled like pebbles, and the very contours of the mountain were permanently altered by nature's violent response to human foolishness. "Move now," Dakota said with urgent simplicity, and they did. Behind them, the entire mountainside convulsed and roared as the avalanche spent its fury, swallowing the two surveyors along with trees, rocks, and everything else that had existed moments before. They reached comparative safety of the tree line, just as destruction sealed the valley below, filling it with displaced snow and debris, while eliminating any possibility of immediate pursuit. They stood in sudden, eerie silence that follows natural catastrophe, breathing hard and covered in fine powder, alive when they should have been dead. "Your path selection saved our lives," Dakota acknowledged. "Your shooting forced them into the killing ground." Hattie replied, noting how his accuracy had compelled attackers to take positions directly where falling snow would claim them with mathematical certainty. Something fundamental had shifted between them during those desperate moments. Trust had been earned through shared peril and mutual salvation, and the foundation of something deeper had been laid in snow and violence and recognition that they could depend completely upon each other when death came calling. The descent through pine forest proved treacherous in entirely different ways. Here, snow had drifted unevenly around massive trunks, creating hidden obstacles and unstable pockets that could trap unwary travelers. Hattie's compromised vision made every step careful negotiation between trust in Dakota's guidance and her own trained ability to read terrain even when she couldn't see clearly. They moved in synchronization that was becoming increasingly natural Dakota breaking trail, while Hattie used surveyor's instincts to spot potential dangers, overhanging branches heavy with snow that could break without warning, hidden logs that might trip them, subtle signs indicating where solid ground dropped away beneath deceptive white surface. During brief rest in a massive pine shelter, Dakota shared more about their destination and the urgency driving them through such dangerous conditions. "My cousin waits in winter camp," he said, voice carrying worry he tried concealing beneath stoic acceptance. "Little Otter, 10 winters old. He was caught in early snow while gathering wood for elders, and fever has held him 3 days. Without proper medicine, he won't survive another night." "What medicine does he need?" "Willow bark from trading post stores prepared correctly to break fever when nothing else works." His dark eyes met hers with intensity, speaking of family bonds deeper than her sheltered experience could comprehend. "The post lies between us and camp, but may be watched by those hunting us." Additional responsibility settled between them like another burden to carry through treacherous snow. They were no longer simply fleeing danger, but racing against time to save a child's life while navigating terrain that could eliminate them without warning. At the trading post, they discovered evidence of conspiracy far more extensive than either had imagined. The building had been systematically ransacked, but not by random thieves. Someone had searched specifically for documents, leaving valuable merchandise untouched while focusing entirely on papers that might reveal uncomfortable truths. Scattered across the floor were shipping invoices and inventory records, painting a disturbing picture of organized deception. Hattie knelt among papers, despite danger of remaining too long, her trained eye catching details that might escape casual observation. "Look at this," she said, holding up a bill of lading with hands trembling from more than cold. Mapping tools and women's sundries shipped to various men in Iron Ridge, all charged to Horace Rudd's account. Dakota examined the document over her shoulder, close enough she could detect pine smoke and leather scenting his clothing. Rudd represents the railroad in territorial negotiations. I've heard his name spoken with suspicion in tribal councils. But examine this. Hattie continued, pointing to another invoice with growing excitement. Supplies shipped to Deputy Sheriff Walt Deaver also charged to Rudd's account. And this payment for correspondence services letters sent to women in eastern cities using forged signatures. The pattern became clear as they pieced together additional documents. Elijah Crane wasn't a single person, but a fabricated identity used by multiple men working for the railroad conspiracy. They had been systematically luring educated women west under false pretenses, using their professional skills to legitimize fraudulent surveys, then presumably forcing them into marriages, preventing exposure, or eliminating them when they proved uncooperative. Hattie was clearly not the first woman caught in this web, and evidence suggested she wouldn't be the last unless they could expose the entire operation. Their investigation was interrupted by sounds making both hearts race with primitive fear. The howl of wolves drawn by blood scent from Dakota's elk meat, and growing bolder as hunger overcame natural caution around humans. The pack emerged from forest, like gray shadows, given deadly substance, lean and desperate from harsh winter, that had driven usual prey to lower elevations or killed them outright. Yellow eyes reflected weak daylight, with predatory intelligence, as they assessed these potential food sources. Dakota quickly lit cloth pieces torn from his spare shirt, creating makeshift torches to drive wolves back, while Hattie gathered precious willow bark with shaking hands. Her movements remained methodical despite danger, showing the same attention to detail that made her valuable as a surveyor. The smoke will draw unwanted human attention. Dakota warned, but they had no choice. Wolves circled with infinite patience of experienced predators, waiting for flames to burn out and leave prey defenseless. That attention materialized sooner than expected. Through forest, they could see orange glow of deliberate fire as someone torched the trading post to force them into the open. Wooden walls caught quickly despite snow and moisture. Soon the entire structure was engulfed in crackling inferno, sending sparks dancing on wind like malevolent fireflies. They fled through the building's back as roof began collapsing in showers of burning timber racing toward frozen river that would lead to the Oglala camp and medicine that might save Little Otter's life. Behind them, burning debris scattered on increasingly dangerous wind, and they could hear men shouting orders as they organized pursuit with systematic efficiency. At river's edge, Hattie's vision problems became critically important. The combination of bright snow reflected light from burning building, and her existing condition made it nearly impossible to judge distances accurately, or spot difference between solid ice supporting their weight and thin patches that would plunge them into water cold enough to kill within minutes. I can't see clearly enough to choose safe footing. She admitted hating to reveal weakness, but knowing false confidence would kill them both more certainly than any bullet. Dakota took her hand, without hesitation, fingers warm and reassuring through shared mittens. "Eyes on me completely," he said with quiet authority, inspiring confidence. "I'll guide every step. Trust my judgment absolutely." They moved onto ice together with careful coordination. Dakota testing each placement before committing their combined weight, Hattie matching his movements with precision she'd once brought to technical drawing. The physical intimacy of connection, his hand guiding hers, their bodies moving in perfect synchronization, created trust deeper than anything she'd experienced with another human being. Ice creaked ominously beneath them, and once she heard the terrifying sound of water moving underneath, reminding them both that their lives depended on accurate judgment of conditions that could change without warning. Each step required complete faith in Dakota's ability to read subtle signs distinguishing safe passage from death trap. When they finally reached the far bank, after what felt like hours, but had probably been minutes, they were both breathing hard from exertion and sustained adrenaline, of mortal terror. Lakota pulled her into shelter of a snow-covered overhang, and their bodies pressed together for both warmth and concealment, as pursuers' torches swept ice behind them. "Thank you," Hattie whispered against his ear, close enough to feel reassuring warmth of his skin despite bitter cold surrounding them. "We survived together," he replied simply, or not at all. The words carried emotional weight extending beyond immediate tactical situation, and Hattie found herself studying his profile in uncertain light, noting strength in his jaw and surprising gentleness in eyes that could turn deadly when circumstances required lethal action. Something was growing between them that transcended mere survival partnership, though neither was ready to name it while death remained so close at hand. The Oglala winter camp appeared through swirling snow like a vision from an entirely different world. Hide lodges glowed with warm interior firelight, smoke rising straight up during brief moments between wind gusts, and voices speaking in melodic Lakota cadences created community warmth, contrasting starkly with hostile wilderness surrounding them. Despite desperate circumstances bringing her here, Hattie found herself noting the practical efficiency of camp organization with her surveyor's eye. Lodges were positioned for mutual wind protection, carefully maintained fire breaks would prevent catastrophic blazes, and essential supplies were cached in multiple locations, preventing total loss from any single disaster. Little Otter lay in Good Elk Woman's Lodge, the tribe's most skilled healer, his small body burning with fever despite the elder's best efforts with traditional remedies. The child's breathing was shallow and rapid. His skin felt like fire to touch clear signs. His condition was deteriorating rapidly. Hattie immediately set to work preparing willow bark they'd risked their lives to obtain using precise measuring techniques that had made her valuable as surveyor to create proper dosage for a child his size and condition. Too little would be ineffective, while too much could prove toxic. "You understand medicine as well as maps," Good Elk Woman observed in careful English, watching Hattie's methodical preparation, with approval transcending cultural differences. "Measurement is measurement," Hattie replied, deeply touched by implicit trust the elder placed in her expertise with her grandchild's life. Whether distances or doses, precision means the difference between success and tragic failure. As Little Otter's fever began responding to properly prepared treatment, his breathing becoming deeper and more regular, Good Elk Woman reached into a carefully preserved bundle and withdrew something that made Hattie's blood freeze with shock and recognition. Letters written in her own distinctive handwriting, but containing words she had never composed. "The widow who cleans for the white sheriff brought these," the elder explained with gravity of someone delivering evidence of serious crimes. "She thought you should see what they did with your words." The letters were addressed to Elijah Crane and written in Hattie's unmistakable script, but content bore no resemblance to anything she'd ever composed. These sophisticated forgeries discussed mapping techniques in technical detail, demonstrating genuine expertise, described specific methods for altering survey data without detection, and most damaging, appeared to request payment for services in falsifying territorial maps for railroad benefit. Hattie's hands shook violently as she compared forged letters to her field notebook, where she'd kept meticulous copies of actual correspondence with fictional Elijah Crane. The paper was identical, clearly stolen from her personal supply. The ink matched exactly down to the specific shade she preferred. Even particular pen nib marks were perfectly replicated by someone with access to her actual writing materials and considerable forgery skill. The realization struck her like a physical blow, stealing breath from her lungs and leaving her gasping. She had not simply been lured west as victim of romantic deception. She had been systematically set up as designated scapegoat for the entire mapping conspiracy. Her mind reeled as she grasped the diabolical completeness of their trap. Every letter she had written in honest enthusiasm, every professional inquiry, every expression of hope for new opportunities, All had been preserved, studied, and used against her. They had taken her own words, her own handwriting, her own professional reputation, and twisted them into a noose designed to hang her when their scheme inevitably collapsed. "They didn't just deceive me," she whispered, her voice barely audible as horror washed over her in waves. "They built my execution from the very beginning." The full emotional impact hit her, then not just anger, but a deeper violation that went to the core of her identity. Her professional integrity, her personal correspondence, even her handwriting had been weaponized against her. She felt sick with the knowledge that somewhere men had sat around tables reading her private thoughts, analyzing her words for ways to destroy her more completely. But Good Elk Woman produced another bundle that made the scope of deception even more horrifyingly clear. Hattie's genuine letters to Elijah Crane, her honest expressions of interest in surveying opportunities and marriage proposal. These authentic documents had been carefully preserved and studied, providing raw material from which forged versions had been crafted with diabolical cleverness. "You were marked for destruction before you ever departed Massachusetts," Dakota said quietly. And Hattie heard something new in his voice. Not suspicion, but understanding mixed with anger on her behalf that touched something deep within her heart. She felt his hand settle gently on her shoulder, warm and reassuring, despite chaos surrounding them. But they made a critical miscalculation. "What mistake?" Hattie asked, though she thought she might understand his meaning. "They assumed you would be helpless when you discovered the truth. They assumed you would accept their lies and submit to whatever fate they planned." His dark eyes met hers in flickering firelight, and she saw respect no man had ever shown her. "They didn't expect you to be strong enough to read their true intentions, skilled enough to expose their deceptions, or brave enough to fight back against impossible odds." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken feelings and growing recognition of qualities in each other that went far beyond mere survival partnership. Hattie found herself studying the clean line of his jaw, the way firelight brought out subtle gold flecks in his dark eyes, the surprising gentleness in hands she'd witnessed capable of deadly precision. But their moment of deepening connection was shattered by sounds of multiple horses approaching through snow, accompanied by harsh voices raised in ugly tones of men who had not come to negotiate. "Light all torches," came a command from outside the camp perimeter, delivered with military authority. "I want them to see us coming and understand that resistance is futile." Through lodge walls, they could hear Deputy Sheriff Walt Deaver's voice, raised to carry across the entire camp. "We have legal warrants for immediate arrest of Hattie Winifred for forgery conspiracy to commit fraud and theft of government property. Surrender her immediately, and no one else need be harmed by her documented crimes." Dakota's jaw tightened with controlled fury as truth became completely clear. Now we know which face Elijah Crane wore when he wrote those letters designed to lure you west. The trap was closing with systematic precision, but something had fundamentally changed during revelations in the lodge. Hattie's innocence was now established beyond reasonable doubt, and more importantly, the bond between her and Dakota had evolved from alliance born of necessity to true partnership based on genuine respect and growing care for each other's welfare. Little Otter stirred on his sleeping furs, fever finally broken by proper application of willow bark medicine, and opened his eyes to look at the strange white woman who had helped save his life. In his innocent gaze, Hattie saw reflected what she hoped Dakota saw as well. Not a criminal or helpless victim, but someone worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth trusting with one's life and future. Deputy Sheriff Walt Deaver's posse surrounded the winter camp with methodical precision, speaking of extensive military training and considerable experience in intimidation tactics. In addition to Deaver himself, a man whose badge carried theoretical weight of territorial law, but whose obvious allegiances lay elsewhere. Hattie counted 8 mounted men, all armed with military rifles and wearing distinctive red bandanas, marking them as railroad operatives rather than legitimate law enforcement. At the group's head rode a figure who could only be Horace Rudd himself, dressed in an expensive wool coat standing out starkly against his subordinates' rough frontier clothing. His presence meant this operation was considered critical enough to warrant personal oversight from the conspiracy's senior leadership. You have exactly 10 minutes to send out the woman and return all stolen government property. Rudd called across camp, his voice carrying authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned obedience. The cultured tones and precise diction marked him as an educated man who viewed himself as superior to everyone around him, and the kind of man who saw others as tools to be used and discarded. After that deadline expires, we will consider everyone here to be harboring known fugitives. In contrast, when Deaver spoke, his voice was rough and brutal, carrying the ugliness of a man who enjoyed causing pain. Save your righteous lectures for someone who cares, old woman. He snarled at Good Elk Woman, spurring his horse closer in calculated intimidation. We know the fugitives are here. We followed their tracks from the river. The threat was both clear and legally questionable. Territorial law required individual warrants and due process, not wholesale intimidation of entire communities. But in remote wilderness days, from federal marshals or territorial judges, Rudd's men represented the only law that mattered practically. Inside the lodge, Dakota's uncle Red Hawk, a weathered warrior in his 50s, who had survived cavalry charges, winter starvation, and every other hardship the frontier could devise, quietly distributed weapons to younger men, while maintaining stoic calm that masked careful preparation for inevitable violence. The tribal defenders were badly outnumbered and significantly outgunned, and any open conflict would inevitably endanger women and children sheltering in other lodges. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. They might kill some attackers, but the cost in innocent lives would be devastating. There's another option, Dakota murmured to Hattie as they crouched beside Little Otter's sleeping form. Forest path leads to high ground, where we might establish defensible positions. Absolutely not, Hattie said with quiet firmness that surprised even herself. If we flee, they'll burn this camp to deny us shelter and punish those who helped us. Innocent people will die because of me, and I won't carry that responsibility. But Red Hawk had reached his own grim conclusion about their limited options. You carry proof of their criminal conspiracy, he said to Dakota in Lakota, then switched to English for Hattie's benefit. That evidence must survive and reach proper authorities, even if we don't live to witness justice being done. Go now, while confusion might provide cover. Their urgent discussion was interrupted by the sharp crack of a warning shot, as one of Rudd's men fired into the air clear signal that patience was running out and violence would soon follow. The sound sent several children crying in terror, and Hattie felt her resolve harden into cold fury that burned hotter than lodge fire. These men had systematically destroyed her life through elaborate deception, murdered innocent people to cover their crimes, and now threatened children to maintain their conspiracy. The time for passive resistance had passed completely. I have developed an alternative plan, she said, reaching for her field case with hands that no longer trembled. But it requires perfect timing, absolute trust, and willingness to risk everything on single coordinated action. She quickly sketched her strategy in snow beside Little Otter's sleeping robes, using surveyor's training to create precise diagram showing positions, timing, and critical sequence of actions that would determine success or catastrophic failure. Red Hawk studied the plan intently, asked 2 clarifying questions demonstrating extensive tactical experience, then nodded with grim approval, despite obvious risks. It's extremely dangerous for everyone involved. Everything has become dangerous now, Hattie replied with calmness, belying her hammering heart. But this gives us the best chance of survival while protecting innocent lives. The plan went into immediate effect as Rudd's patience expired, and he signaled his men to advance with weapons raised. Hattie emerged from Good Elk Woman's lodge with hands clearly visible, but not raised in surrender, making herself an obvious target while maintaining personal dignity that had sustained her through every challenge since leaving Massachusetts. "I am Hattie Winifred," she called out clearly, her voice carrying across camp with surprising authority. "I'm prepared to discuss terms for my surrender, but the alleged stolen property remains with my protectors as insurance for safe passage for everyone in this camp." Rudd spurred his horse forward aggressively, close enough to study her face in uncertain torchlight. "You are in no position whatsoever to negotiate any terms, Miss Winifred," he said with the condescending tone of a man who believed his education and position made him inherently superior. "You are a wanted fugitive, surrounded by my legally constituted posse. Your only choice is immediate, unconditional surrender." But even as he spoke with false confidence, Lakota was implementing the second phase of their coordinated plan. Moving through shadows between lodges with silent efficiency that had made him a successful hunter throughout his adult life. His target wasn't the armed men who expected attack, but the kerosene lanterns they'd brought to illuminate their assault. Weeks of seepage had soaked the timber and canvas. In the lee of the depot wall, kerosene vapors pooled. One muzzle flash was enough to turn the air itself into fuel. His arrows flew with deadly precision, born of years of practice, shattering glass reservoirs and spilling burning fuel across snow in calculated patterns that created dangerous, unpredictable flames between attackers and intended victims. The effect was immediate and devastating to their organized assault. Chaos erupted as horses reared and scattered away from sudden fires, riders fighting to maintain control of panicked animals while preserving tactical positions. Men shouted conflicting orders while trying to manage frightened mounts and maintain encirclement of camp perimeter. The careful coordination of their attack dissolved into confusion and individual survival instincts. In that critical moment of disorder, Red Hawk and his warriors struck with deadly efficiency that came from years of experience in asymmetric warfare against superior numbers and equipment. Their goal wasn't to kill indiscriminately, that would bring inevitable cavalry retribution, but to disable and scatter attackers while minimizing casualties on both sides. Arrows found horses' legs with surgical precision, sending riders tumbling into deep snowdrifts where they struggled to regain footing while weapons scattered beyond reach. Well-aimed stones extinguished remaining lanterns with accurate targeting, plunging portions of the assault force into darkness, heavily favoring defenders who knew every detail of terrain intimately. The battle became a masterpiece of tactical intelligence against brute force. Lakota warriors used every advantage knowledge of ground ability to move silently through snow coordination developed through years of hunting together. They struck from unexpected angles, melted back into darkness, struck again from different positions. It was warfare refined through generations of survival against overwhelming odds. But victory came at a terrible and irreplaceable cost. As Rudd's disorganized men retreated in confusion, one of them fired wildly into camp without regard for targets or consequences. The bullet found Red Hawk as the older warrior helped evacuate children from a lodge threatened by spreading flames. The impact spun Red Hawk around and dropped him into snow that immediately began turning red with his life's blood. Lakota reached his uncle's side just as awareness was leaving the older man's eyes forever. There was no time for proper farewells, no opportunity for ritual words that should accompany a respected warrior's passage from this world to the next. Red Hawk gripped Dakota's hand with failing strength, his voice barely a whisper as life ebbed away. The people must survive. You must carry the fight forward. Do not let their sacrifice be meaningless. He pressed something small and carved into Dakota's palm, a token that had belonged to their ancestors for generations. Remember who you are, what you fight for. Then he was gone, leaving behind only memory and sacred obligation to continue his fight for justice and tribal survival. The loss struck Dakota like a physical blow that threatened to overwhelm his ability to function. Grief and rage warred in his chest, but there was no time to mourn properly or honor his uncle's memory as tradition demanded. Rudd was already shouting orders to reorganize his scattered forces for another assault, and kerosene fires had spread to threaten one of the outer lodges where families sheltered. The entire camp had to be evacuated immediately, abandoning the winter shelter that had sustained the community through harsh months, when survival was measured in degrees of cold and carefully preserved supplies. As families fled into forest, carrying what possessions they could salvage, Hattie found herself working alongside Dakota and Good Elk Woman to gather essential medical supplies that would mean difference between life and death in weeks ahead. Little Otter, now fully recovered from fever, but still weak, clung to his grandmother's skirts as they prepared to abandon their home to flames and their enemies' malice. River ice is breaking up from warm springs upstream. Good Elk Woman warned with authority of someone who had observed seasonal patterns for decades. Soon, it won't support safe crossing, and will be trapped on this side with nowhere to run when they reorganize. They had perhaps an hour before their escape route was completely eliminated, and behind them, Rudd's furious voice could be heard rallying his men for another assault that would show no mercy to anyone found in the area. But as they prepared to leave the burning remnants of their temporary safety, Hattie felt Dakota's hand find hers in smoke-filled darkness. His grief for his uncle was evident in rigid tension of his shoulders and the way he kept glancing back toward where Red Hawk had fallen. But his grip was steady and reassuring, despite emotional turmoil she knew he was experiencing. "We will survive this night," he said quietly, and certainty in his voice made her believe it might actually be possible despite overwhelming odds against them. The journey to Tom Brixley's isolated homestead became a desperate race against multiple disasters unfolding simultaneously across the transformed mountain landscape. River ice beneath their feet groaned and shifted with each careful step, warm springs from deep underground, creating increasingly unstable patches that could collapse without warning and plunge them into water cold enough to kill within minutes. Behind them, the reorganized posse followed with torches, creating an ominous orange glow against storm-darkened sky. Their pursuit methodical and relentless, despite difficult conditions. Ahead, increasing sound of rushing water indicated spring breakup was accelerating far faster than normal seasonal patterns would suggest. Little Otter rode on Dakota's strong back, the child still weakened by recent fever, but alert enough to point out dangerous spots where ice showed telltale signs of instability, dark patches indicating thin coverage over moving water, or areas where surface had refrozen after partial melting in deceptive patterns. The abandoned mine depot came into view just as their situation reached genuine crisis point. Originally constructed to store explosives and heavy equipment for railroads' mountain excavation work, the facility had been abandoned when geological surveys revealed the route was fundamentally unstable. But containers of kerosene and blasting powder remained scattered around the site like a stockpile of potential destruction waiting for the right catalyst. Even from a distance, Hattie could smell the sharp scent of leaked kerosene, could see dark stains in snow where containers had been seeping their volatile contents throughout the winter months. The very air seemed charged with potential violence, as if the slightest spark would ignite destruction beyond human control. Rudd appeared on the ridge above them with 6 of his remaining men, their rifles trained down on the fleeing group with military precision that left no doubt about their intentions. End of the trail. "Miss Winifred," he called with confidence, of someone who believed victory was inevitable, and justice was whatever served his interests. His cultured voice carried clearly in the thin air, each word precisely enunciated, like a professor delivering a lecture. Surrender immediately and completely, and I give you my personal word that the others will be permitted to leave this area unharmed. The promise was obviously worthless. Rudd couldn't afford to leave witnesses alive who had seen forged letters and stolen maps, especially witnesses whose testimony could expose the full scope of conspiracy to territorial authorities. Your word. Hattie called back, her voice ringing with contempt that surprised even herself. The word of a man who forges letters, murders innocents, and corrupts territorial officials. Your word is worth less than the paper you used to destroy my life. For the first time, she saw uncertainty flicker across Rudd's face. He had expected a frightened, helpless woman, not someone who could match his educated diction while exposing his crimes with clinical precision. Lakota carefully handed little Otter to his grandmother and reached for his bow, but Hattie stopped him with firm hand on his arm and shake of her head. Gunfire near those containers, she said quietly, nodding toward abandoned supplies with their ominous warnings about explosive contents. Look at the way they're positioned, relative to that natural depression filled with accumulated snow. The tactical implications were terrifying, but potentially decisive. If volatile materials were ignited by rifle fire, the resulting explosion would not only eliminate their immediate threat, but also trigger massive avalanche that would seal entire area under tons of rock and snow, unfortunately with them still in immediate danger zone. But as they weighed their impossible options, with desperate calculation of people who had exhausted conventional alternatives, salvation arrived from entirely unexpected direction. Clara Bell emerged from forest, moving on snowshoes with determined stride of someone who had made life-changing decision to risk everything for justice. A rifle held competently in her hands, leather satchel slung across her shoulder containing evidence that could change everything. Deputy Deaver, she called up to the ridge with clear authority that commanded immediate attention. I carry signed affidavits from 3 territorial judges, documented evidence of your extensive conspiracy with railroad interests, and sworn testimony from multiple reliable witnesses who observed your criminal activities over extended period. Surrender immediately, and you might live to see proper legal proceedings conducted according to territorial law. The documents she'd risked her life to preserve through dangerous night journey included shipping invoices from trading post, copies of forged letters, witness statements from townspeople who had seen Deaver's men copying maps in sheriff's office, and additional evidence painting complete picture of organized fraud, extending far beyond Iron Ridge's boundaries. But Rudd's response revealed true depth of his desperation and willingness to commit murder to protect his conspiracy from exposure. He raised his rifle toward Clara with obvious intent to eliminate an inconvenient witness. But that decision proved to be his final and most costly mistake. Lakota's arrow took him high in the shoulder, with perfect precision, spinning him around and sending his shot wild into trees where it could harm no one. But the muzzle flash ignited kerosene vapors that had been accumulating throughout winter months, and suddenly the night exploded into brilliant orange flame that illuminated entire mountainside with hellish intensity. What happened next defied human comprehension. The depot didn't simply explode, it erupted in a cascading chain reaction that turned night into day and earth into hell. The first blast triggered secondary explosions as containers of blasting powder caught fire in sequence, each detonation adding to the growing inferno that consumed everything within hundreds of yards. Hattie felt the heat wash over her, like opening an oven door, followed immediately by concussion that knocked her flat and drove air from her lungs. The sound was indescribable, not just noise, but physical force that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. She could taste copper, and smoke could feel the ground buck beneath her like a living thing in agony. The explosions triggered exactly the catastrophic avalanche she had predicted with scientific accuracy. But seeing it happen was like witnessing the end of the world. Thousands of tons of snow and rock roared down the slope, with voice of an angry mountain, swallowing Rudd's remaining men and sealing area under white shroud that would not melt until spring brought warmth back to high country. Trees centuries old vanished in seconds. Boulders the size of houses rolled like pebbles, and the very contours of the mountain were permanently altered by nature's violent response to human foolishness. The avalanche seemed to go on forever, building momentum as it gathered more snow and debris, until finally it spent its fury in the valley below, with a silence that felt almost supernatural after such violence. In the aftermath of the explosion, with fires burning throughout the area and air filled with smoke and falling snow that obscured vision and made breathing difficult, Tom Brixley emerged from his modest sod house near the river bend. His pregnant wife had gone into labor during chaos of the attack, and he desperately needed assistance from anyone with medical knowledge. What followed was perhaps the most intense and demanding hour of Hattie's entire life. While Clara Bell attended to the birth with calm efficiency, and Good Elk Woman provided traditional medical expertise that proved invaluable, Hattie and Dakota worked frantically to extinguish fires that threatened to spread to the homestead and destroy their only remaining shelter. Her hands burned while handling heated metal debris from explosion made every task difficult and painful. But she pushed through agony with determination that surprised even herself. The sound of new life entering the world. Tom's healthy son arriving. Just as first hints of dawn began penetrating smoke-filled sky, provided hope and renewal that counterbalanced destruction and death surrounding them. But even as they celebrated the miracle of birth and their own unlikely survival, evidence of conspiracy had to be secured and documented if they were to prevent future victims from falling into the same elaborate trap. Rudd had survived the explosion, though badly injured and partially buried in snow that had probably saved his life by protecting him from worst effects of blast. In his delirium and pain, he began confessing details of scheme that Clara carefully recorded, creating testimony that would prove invaluable in territorial court proceedings. In the spring of 1873, before the territorial court at Cheyenne, sworn affidavits and shipping ledgers shattered Rudd's defense. As sun rose, fully casting long shadows across devastated landscape that bore little resemblance to peaceful Mountain Valley, it had been just hours before Dr. Amos Reed arrived with cavalry detachment from Fort Laramie. Clara's messages had reached her cousin despite dangerous conditions, and he had come as quickly as military protocol and winter travel would allow. The immediate crisis was finally over, but emotional and physical toll was evident on every survivor's face. Red Hawk was gone. Winter camp had been completely destroyed, and several good men had lost their lives to corporate greed and systematic deception. But there was one moment as Hattie sat beside warming fire in Tom Brixley's humble sod house, while Good Elk Woman tended to her burned hands with traditional remedies that proved more effective than anything in Dr. Reed's military medical kit, when she felt Dakota settle quietly beside her with natural ease that had developed between them. "I keep thinking about what my uncle said," Dakota said quietly, his voice carrying grief that would take time to heal. "About carrying the fight forward, not letting their sacrifice be meaningless." "What will you do?" Hattie asked, though she suspected she already knew his answer. "What needs to be done? Ensure justice is served, that the truth is told, that this never happens to another family." He paused, studying her face in the firelight. "But I find myself hoping I won't have to do it alone." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning that went far beyond their immediate circumstances. Here in the aftermath of violence and loss, something new was being born between them. Not just attraction or partnership, but genuine understanding of what they could build together. "Tell me about your world," Hattie said softly. "Not the danger, Not the survival, tell me about the good parts, the parts worth fighting for. And so he did, speaking of summer hunts, when the entire tribe worked together, of winter stories told around fires, of children learning the old ways while adapting to new realities. He spoke of his grandmother, who had taught him to read the sky for weather, of his father, who had shown him how to track animals through any terrain, of the delicate balance between tradition and change that defined his people's daily existence. In return, Hattie shared memories of her work that had brought joy, mapping harbors that would guide ships safely home, creating surveys that helped families find good land, and the satisfaction of taking chaos and making it comprehensible. She spoke of her fears about her failing eyesight, her loneliness in a profession dominated by men who saw her as in curiosity, at best her dreams of work that would matter beyond mere technical accuracy. As they talked through the night, taking turns tending the fire and checking on the new mother and baby, something settled between them that felt like the foundation of a life they might build together. Not the desperate alliance of survival, but the careful consideration of two people who had seen each other at their worst and best and found something worth preserving. Spring arrived in Iron Ridge, with gradual transformation that turns harsh mountain country from winter's battleground into summer's promise. The territorial court proceedings had concluded with comprehensive convictions that sent shockwaves through railroad company boardrooms across the entire region. Justice had been served despite systematic attempts to minimize legal exposure. Hattie's name had been completely cleared, with substantial financial compensation awarded not only for her ordeal, but for valuable evidence she'd provided. The settlement money represented new freedom, ability to choose her future based on preference rather than necessity. Her eyesight, examined by specialists, would continue deteriorating gradually, but not progress to complete blindness. With proper precautions and adapted techniques, she could continue professional work for years to come. Though recommendations were for larger-scale projects rather than detailed technical drawing. Through the warming months, she and Dakota had worked together on innovative mapping project that served both settler needs and tribal interests, while establishing new standards for territorial cartography. Their maps showed safe routes for legitimate development, while clearly marking sacred sites, seasonal hunting grounds, and traditional camping areas that were to remain undisturbed. The work had required countless hours side by side, discussing technical details and cultural considerations with focused intensity that had characterized their original survival efforts. But now that intensity was creative rather than desperate, building something valuable rather than simply avoiding death. Their professional partnership had evolved naturally into personal affection, marked by small gestures and growing comfort with each other's presence, that spoke of deep compatibility beyond shared hardship. When Clara Bell announced her intention to establish permanent school serving both settler and tribal children, she asked Hattie to consider teaching mathematics and technical drawing. "I've been thinking about what you said," Hattie told Dakota one evening as they walked along the river that had nearly claimed their lives. "About choosing rather than being deceived into accepting circumstances beyond our control." "And what conclusion have you reached?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected her answer. "I choose to stay in this place, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is where I want to build whatever future awaits us." Dakota stopped walking and turned to face her directly, moonlight reflecting off water behind them. "Building that future together as true partners, if you believe that would be wise," Hattie replied, suddenly aware her heart was beating faster than their leisurely pace should require. "I understand the differences between our backgrounds make such partnership complicated. All the most accurate maps show complicated territory," Dakota said with slight smile that had become increasingly dear to her. "That complexity doesn't make them less valuable or less essential for safe travel." The proposal, when it finally came, was as practical and honest as everything else about their relationship had been since that first desperate night in the mountain cabin. They would marry according to both territorial law and tribal custom, establishing household that honored both their cultural backgrounds while creating something entirely new. Dr. Reed performed the territorial ceremony in Clara's schoolhouse on bright June morning when wildflowers covered mountain meadows. Good Elk Woman conducted traditional tribal blessing beside the river where they'd first crossed dangerous ice together with Little Otter, serving as solemn witness despite his youth. The final surprise came in an official letter from Boston delivered by monthly mail service. Hattie's former employer, responding to Dr. Reed's detailed correspondence about conspiracy, had conducted his own investigation and discovered extensive evidence of Rudd's advanced planning and systematic fraud. The railroad company, faced with overwhelming evidence of criminal conspiracy, had agreed to substantial financial settlements for all victims. More importantly, they had committed to using only legitimate surveys for future projects, with independent verification of all mapping data. It appears we've succeeded in changing how they conduct business operations, Hattie observed, reading the letter aloud as they sat on porch of their new cabin, built with compensation money on land, purchased fairly through proper legal channels. Perhaps the next surveyors who work in this region will draw honest lines that serve everyone's legitimate interests. Dakota replied with satisfaction that went beyond personal victory to encompass broader hopes for justice. As summer settled over Iron Ridge with comfortable warmth that makes mountain living pleasant rather than merely survivable, their life together developed satisfying rhythms of successful partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Hattie taught mathematics and surveying principles to Clara's diverse students, while continuing professional mapping work requiring her particular combination of technical skill and cultural sensitivity. Dakota served as guide and translator for legitimate survey crews, while maintaining traditional activities that kept him connected to natural world that had shaped his character. Little Otter became frequent visitor to their cabin, fascinated by surveying instruments and eager to learn technical skills that would help him navigate between traditional world of his grandparents and modern world rapidly transforming the American West. On quiet evenings, Hattie and Dakota would sometimes walk to site where they'd first shared desperate shelter, now marked by small stone monument Clara had commissioned to commemorate events that had brought them together, while nearly destroying them both. Do you ever wonder what might have happened if that winter storm hadn't driven you to seek shelter in that particular cabin? Hattie asked one evening as they watched sunset paint surrounding mountains in shades of gold and purple. Never. Dakota replied without hesitation, his hand finding hers with easy familiarity that had developed through shared trials and growing love. Some paths are destined to cross regardless of circumstances. The storm simply made our meeting happen sooner rather than later. As they walked back toward their comfortable cabin, hands linked and steps matched in easy synchronization that had first kept them alive on treacherous ice, both understood their story had reached its proper and satisfying conclusion. The deception that had brought them together had been completely exposed, and resolved criminals had been punished appropriately, and innocent people had been protected from future victimization. But more importantly than achieving justice, they had discovered in each other something neither had been actively seeking, but both had desperately needed. Their carefully drawn maps would guide other travelers safely through dangerous territory for years to come. Their marriage would continue bridging different worlds with respect and understanding. And their partnership would endure because it had been built on an unshakable foundation of mutual respect, proven competence, and genuine affection earned through trials that had tested every aspect of their characters. The storm that had forced them to share shelter and trust each other with their lives had long since passed into memory. But warmth they had discovered in each other's company would sustain them through all seasons yet to come. In their shared future, whatever challenges or opportunities that future might bring to the territory they had chosen to call home.